We're picking up where we left off yesterday in the middle of Chapter 5, page 72, bottom section. A Kibbutz drummer left us, a victim of the selection. Lately he had wandered among us, his eyes glazed, telling everyone of his weakness. "I can't go on. It's all over." It was impossible to raise his morale. He didn't listen to what we told him. He could only repeat that all was over for him, that he could no longer keep up the struggle, that he had no strength left, no faith. Suddenly his eyes would become blank, nothing but two open wounds, two pits of terror. He was not the only one to lose his faith during these selection days. I knew a rabbi from a little town in Poland, a bent old man, whose lips were always trembling. He used to pray all the time, in the block, in the yard, in the ranks. He would recite whole pages of the Talmud from memory, argue with himself, ask himself questions and answer himself. And one day he said to me, "It's the end. God is no longer with us." And, as though he had repented of having spoken such words, so clipped, so cold, he added in his faint voice, "I know. One has no right to say things like that. I know. Man is too small, too humble, and inconsiderable to seek to understand the mysterious ways of God. But what can I do? I'm not a sage, one of the elect, nor a saint. I'm just an ordinary creature of flesh and blood. I've got eyes too, and I can see what they're doing here. Where is the divine mercy? Where is God? How can I believe? How could anyone believe in this merciful God?" Poor Akiba Drummer. If he could have gone on believing in God, if he could have seen a proof of God in his Calvary, he would not have been taken by the selection. But as soon as he felt the first cracks forming in his faith, he had lost his reason for struggling and had begun to die. When the selection came, he was condemned in advance, offering his own neck to the executioner. All he asked of us was, "In 3 days I shall no longer be here. Say the Kaddish for me." We promised him. In 3 days' time, when we saw the smoke rising from the chimney, we would think of him. 10 of us would gather together and hold a special service. All his friends would say the Kaddish. Then he went off toward the hospital, his step steadier, not looking back. An ambulance was waiting to take him to Birkenau. These were terrible days. We received more blows than food. We were crushed with work, and 3 days after he had gone, we forgot to say the Kaddish. Winter had come. The days were short, and the nights had become almost unbearable. In the first hours of dawn, the icy wind cut us like a whip. We were given winter clothes, slightly thicker striped shirts. The veterans found in this a new source of derision. "Now you'll really be getting a taste of the camp." We left for work as usual, our bodies frozen. The stones were so cold that it seemed as though our hands would be glued to them if we touched them. But you get used to anything. On Christmas and New Year's Day there was no work. We were allowed a slightly thicker soup. Toward the middle of January, my right foot began to swell because of the cold. I was unable to put it on the ground. I went to have it examined. The doctor, a great Jewish doctor, a prisoner like ourselves, was quite definite. I must have an operation. If we waited, the toes, and perhaps the whole leg, would have to be amputated. This was the last straw, but I had no choice. The doctor had decided on an operation, and there was no discussing it. I was even glad that it was he who had made the decision. They put me into a bed with white sheets. I had forgotten that people slept in sheets. The hospital was not bad at all. We were given good bread and thicker soup. No more bell, no more roll call, no more work. Now and then I was able to send a bit of bread to my father. Near me lay a Hungarian Jew who had been struck down with dysentery, skin and bone, with dead eyes. I could only hear his voice. It was the sole indication that he was alive. Where did he get the strength to talk? "You mustn't rejoice too soon, my boy. There's selection here too, more often than outside. Germany doesn't need sick Jews. Germany doesn't need me. When the next transport comes, you'll have a new neighbor. So listen to me and take my advice. Get out of the hospital before the next election." These words came from underground, from a faceless shape, filled me with terror. It was indeed true that the hospital was very small, and that if new invalids arrived in the next few days, room would have to be found for them. But perhaps my faceless neighbor, fearing that he would be among the first victims, simply wanted to drive me away, to free my bed in order to give himself a chance to survive. Perhaps he just wanted to frighten me. Yet what if he were telling the truth? I decided to await events. The doctor came to tell me that the operation would be the next day. Don't be afraid, he added. Everything will be all right. At 10 o'clock in the morning they took me into the operating room. My doctor was there. I took comfort from this. I felt that nothing serious could happen while he was there. There was balm in every word he spoke, and every glance he gave me held a message of hope. It will hurt you a bit, he said, but that will pass. Grit your teeth. The operation lasted an hour. They had not put me to sleep. I kept my eyes fixed upon my doctor. Then I felt myself go under. When I came round, opening my eyes, I could see nothing at first but a great whiteness, my sheets. Then I noticed the face of my doctor bending over me. Everything went off well. You're brave, my boy. Now you're going to stay here for 2 weeks, rest comfortably, and it will be over. You'll eat well, and relax your body and your nerves. I could only follow the movement of his lips. I scarcely understood what he was saying, but the murmur of his voice did me good. Suddenly a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I could not feel my leg. Had they amputated it? Doctor, I stammered. Doctor. What's the matter, son? I lacked the courage to ask him the question. Doctor, I'm thirsty. He had water brought to me. He was smiling. He was getting ready to go and visit the other patients. Doctor? What? Shall I still be able to use my leg? He was no longer smiling. I was very frightened. He said, Do you trust me, my boy? I trust you absolutely, doctor. Well, then listen to me. You'll be completely recovered in a fortnight. You'll be able to walk like anyone else. The sole of your foot was all full of pus. We just had to open the swelling. You haven't had your leg amputated. You'll see. In a fortnight's time you'll be walking about like anyone else. I had only a fortnight to wait. 2 days after my operation, there was a rumor going round the camp that the front had suddenly drawn near. The Red Army, they said, was advancing on Buna. It was only a matter of hours now. We were already accustomed to rumors of this kind. It was not the first time a false prophet had foretold to us peace on earth, negotiations with the Red Cross for our release, or other false rumors. And often we believed them. It was an injection of morphine. But this time these prophecies seemed more solid. During these last few nights we had heard the guns in the distance. My neighbor, the faceless one, said, Don't let yourself be fooled with illusions. Hitler has made it very clear that he will annihilate all the Jews before the clock strikes 12, before they can hear the last stroke. I burst out, What does it matter to you? Do we have to regard Hitler as a prophet? His glazed, faded eyes looked at me. At last he said in a weary voice, I've got more faith in Hitler than in anyone else. He's the only one who's kept his promises, all his promises, to the Jewish people. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the same day, as usual, Bell summoned all the heads of the block to go and report. They came back shattered. They could only just open their lips enough to say the word. Evacuation. The camp was to be emptied, and we were to be sent farther back. Where to? To somewhere right in the depths of Germany, to other camps. There was no shortage of them. When? Tomorrow evening. Perhaps the Russians will arrive first. Perhaps. We knew perfectly well they would not. The camp had become a hive. People ran about shouting at one another. In all the blocks preparations for the journey were going on. I had forgotten about my bad foot. A doctor came into the room and announced, Tomorrow, immediately after nightfall, the camp will set out, block after block. Patients will stay in the infirmary. They will not be evacuated. This news made us think. Were the SS going to leave hundreds of prisoners to strut about in the hospital blocks, waiting for their liberators? Were they going to let the Jews hear the 12th stroke sound? Obviously not. All the invalids will be summarily killed, said the faceless one, and sent to the crematory in one final batch. The camp is certain to be mined, said another. The moment the evacuation's over, it'll blow up. As for me, I was not thinking about death, but I did not want to be separated from my father. We had already suffered so much, borne so much together. This was not the time to be separated. I ran outside to look for him. The snow was thick, and the windows of the blocks were veiled with frost. One shoe in my hand, because it would not go on my right foot, I ran on, feeling neither pain nor cold. What shall we do? My father did not answer. What shall we do, father? He was lost in thought. The choice was in our hands. For once we could decide our fate for ourselves. We could both stay in the hospital, where I could, thanks to my doctor, get him entered as a patient or a nurse. Or else we could follow the others. Well, what shall we do, father? He was silent. Let's be evacuated with the others, I said to him. He did not answer. He looked at my foot. Do you think you can walk? Yes, I think so. Let's hope we shan't regret it, Eliezer. I learned after the war the fate of those who had stayed behind in the hospital. They were quite simply liberated by the Russians 2 days after the evacuation. I did not go back to the hospital again. I returned to my block. My wound was open and bleeding. The snow had grown red where I had trodden. The head of the block gave out double rations of bread and margarine for the journey. We could take as many shirts and other clothes as we liked from the store. It was cold. We got into bed. The last night in Buna. Yet another last night. The last night at home, the last night in the ghetto, the last night in the train, and now the last night in Buna. How much longer were our lives to be dragged out from one last night to another? I did not sleep at all. Through the frosted panes bursts of red light could be seen. Cannon shots split the nighttime silence. How close the Russians were! Between them and us, one night, our last night. There was whispering from one bed to another. With luck, the Russians would be here before the evacuation. Hope revived again. Someone shouted, "Try and sleep. Gather your strength for the journey." This reminded me of my mother's last words of advice in the ghetto. But I could not sleep. My foot felt as if it were burning. In the morning, the face of the camp had changed. Prisoners appeared in strange outfits. It was like a masquerade. Everyone had put on several garments, one on top of the other, in order to keep out the cold. Poor mountebanks, wider than they were tall, more dead than alive. Poor clowns, their ghost-like faces emerging from piles of prison clothes. Buffoons. I tried to find a shoe that was too large. In vain. I tore up a blanket and wrapped my wounded foot in it. Then I went wandering through the camp, looking for a little more bread and a few potatoes. Some said we were being taken to Czechoslovakia. No, to Grossrosen. No, to Kleibwitz. No, to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The snow was still coming down thickly. The time was passing quickly now. Dusk had fallen. The day was disappearing in a monochrome of gray. The head of the block suddenly remembered that he had forgotten to clean out the block. He ordered 4 prisoners to wash the wooden floor. An hour before leaving the camp. Why? For whom? For the liberating army, he cried, so that they'll realize there were men living here, and not pigs. Were we men, then? The block was cleaned from top to bottom, washed in every corner. At 6 o'clock the bell rang, the death knell, the burial. The procession was about to begin its march. Form up, quickly! In a few moments we were all in rows, by blocks. Night had fallen. Everything was in order, according to the prearranged plan. The searchlights came on. Hundreds of armed SS men rose up out of the darkness, accompanied by sheepdogs. The snow never ceased. The gates of the camp opened. It seemed that an even darker night was waiting for us on the other side. The first blocks began to march. We waited. We had to wait for the departure of the 56 blocks who came before us. It was very cold. In my pocket I had 2 pieces of bread. With how much pleasure could I have eaten them? But I was not allowed to. Not yet. Our turn was coming. Block 53. Block 55. Block 57. Forward march. It snowed relentlessly.